Welcome to the deep dive from the First Christian Church of Lyons, Kansas, where our mission is to know Jesus and make his name known. My name is Nikia. I am the pastor here, and today we are taking one final deep dive into our sermon series, Where Were You? Our journey through the book of Job. Throughout this series, we have held two difficult questions. The first question is what we ask God in our suffering. God, where were you? Where were you when the diagnosis came? Where were you when the relationship ended? Where were you when the phone rang with the news that changed everything? Where were you when I prayed and the situation did not improve? Where were you when the person I loved died? Where were you when life began unraveling faster than I could hold it together? Then, near the end of Job's story, God asks a question of his own. Where were you? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I set boundaries for the oceans? Where were you when the morning stars sang together? God's question is not intended to humiliate Job or shame him for grieving. It's meant to restore the proper relationship between the Creator and his creation. It reminds Job and it reminds us that God is God and we are not. That truth can sound harsh if we use it carelessly. If we can sound like we're telling someone that their pain does not matter, that they should stop asking questions. But that is not what we see in Job. God, he allows Job to speak. And for chapter after chapter, Job, he cries out, laments, protests, wrestles, and questions. God does not strike him down for doing so. Job's grief is not treated as a failure of faith. The problem begins when Job moves from bringing his pain to God to placing God on trial. There is a difference between saying, God, I do not understand, and saying, God, because I do not understand, you must be wrong. There's a difference between wrestling with God and demanding that our God submit to our understanding. That's the tension we find in Job 40. Job 40, it begins in verse 6. We turn to that. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, so I want us to notice where God speaks from. God speaks out of the storm. He does not wait until the storm is over. He does not call Job out of the storm before speaking to him. He meets Job within it. And that matters because we often assume we will encounter God more clearly once everything settles down. Once the crisis has passed, then we'll see God. Once we have healed, then we will worship. Once the prayer has been answered, then we will testify. Once we understand what happened, then we will trust. But Job encounters God before the story is resolved. He encounters God while the question remains. That may be one of the most important lessons from this entire book. We do not have to wait for the storm to pass before we can experience the presence of God. God is present in the unanswered question. He is present in the hospital room. He is present beside the empty chair. He is present in the tears. He is present in the silence. He is present when our faith is strong, and he is present when all we can say is, Jesus, please stay near. See, Job wanted God to give him an explanation, and instead, God gave Job a revelation of himself. Job asked, why? God answered, look at me. And at first, that may feel unsatisfying because we want answers. We want to know why something happened and how everything will eventually work out. But would an explanation have made Job's loss painless? Even if Job had received all the information given to us in the beginning chapters, would it have made burying his children easier? Would it have removed the grief? Would it have restored what was lost? Job needed more than information. Job needed God, and that's what God gave him. This is also where we need to be careful about tidying Job's story. Because if we continue reading, we eventually arrive at the restoration. Job's health is restored, his possessions increase, he has more children, and he lives a long life. And it looks like a beautiful bow tied around a painful story. But new children did not replace the children Job buried. New blessings did not erase old wounds. Future joy did not make the earlier suffering acceptable or insignificant. Job could experience healing and still carry grief. He could hold gratitude and sorrow at the same time. He could laugh again and still remember. Restoration is real, but restoration is not replacement. And this matters because we sometimes treat healing as if it means never feeling the pain again. We assume that if the grief returns, we must be moving backward. But grief is not a straight line. It has no predictable timetable. It can appear in a song, a smell, an anniversary, a familiar place, an empty chair, or a telephone number we still cannot bring ourselves to delete. Grief often returns because love remembers. Feeling the pain does not mean you are failing. It does not mean that you have not prayed enough. It does not mean that God has not been healing you. It means that something mattered. It means that someone mattered. The goal of grief is not to forget. The goal is to learn how to carry what happened without allowing it to carry us away. Unfortunately, we do not always know how to make room for grief. We try to bypass it. We fill every quiet moment with noise. We stay busy. We go back to work too soon. We care for everyone else so we don't have to have the knowledge of what is happening within us. We may even use spiritual language to avoid our pain. Everything happens for a reason. God is in control. Just pray about it. At least they're in a better place. And some of these statements may contain some truth, but truth spoken without tenderness can cause another wound. Sometimes God is in control because a way of ending a painful conversation. Sometimes just pray about it really means I don't know what to do with your pain. Sometimes we use theology to distance ourselves from suffering instead of allowing the love of Jesus to draw us into it. That is called spiritual bypassing. It happens when we use spiritual language or practices to avoid experiencing an emotional wound. We quote a verse rather than tell the truth. We force ourselves to appear grateful rather than acknowledging that we are angry. We call our avoidance peace. We call our silence surrender. We call emotional numbness faith. But Jesus did not teach us to pretend. At the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus wept. Jesus knew resurrection was coming. He knew Lazarus would soon walk out of that tomb, yet Jesus did not tell everyone to stop crying because everything was about to be fixed. He joined them in their grief. Resurrection hope did not prevent Jesus from weeping over what death had done. In the garden, Jesus said, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He did not hide his distress. He did not pretend that he was unaffected. He asked his friends to stay near. He fell to the ground. He asked the Father if the cup could pass from him. Then he prayed, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." That is not grief being bypassed. That is grief and trusting existing in the same body. On the cross, Jesus cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And Jesus shows us that faithfulness can include questions. Faithfulness can include tears. Faithfulness can include disappointment. Faithfulness can sound like lament. And sometimes faithfulness is nothing more than taking one more breath in the presence of God. This brings me back to this image of cattle standing in a storm. There's this familiar illustration about buffalo turning toward an approaching storm and walking into it. Instead of running away, they move through it. And that sounds brave and powerful. There are moments when I want to say, be the buffalo, face the storm, keep moving. And perhaps there are seasons when that is exactly what courage requires. But as I have watched cattle, I have wondered whether they might teach us something equally important. Cattle do not always charge into the storm. In fact, they actually settle into it. They find shelter when shelter is available. They gather together, they lower their heads, and when there is nowhere else to go, they stand in the rain. They do not try to reason with the storm. They cannot demand that the clouds move faster. They cannot stop the rain from falling. They cannot perform their way out of the weather. They simply remain. And maybe there are times when we should be the buffalo. But there are also times, I think more times than not, when faith looks like cattle standing in the rain. Sometimes we do not need to conquer the storm. Sometimes we need permission to endure it. Sometimes strength is getting out of bed. Sometimes courage is allowing someone to sit beside us. Sometimes worship is showing up with no words to sing. Sometimes faith is whispering, "Jesus, I am still here." We do not always have to have power through grief. Grief is not a test we pass by appearing strong. Grief is not a problem we solve. Grief is an experience we must be allowed to endure. And we endure it best in the presence of God and the presence of safe people. If you're grieving, receive whatever shelter is available. Allow someone to bring you a meal. Call the trusted friend. Talk with a pastor, counselor, a therapist. Tell the truth when you are not doing well. Rest when your body is tired. Cry when the tears come. Laugh when laughter surprises you without feeling guilty for it. Healing does not require you to choose between grief and joy. Over time, we learn to hold both. If you're walking beside someone who is grieving, resist the temptation to tidy their story. You do not have to explain why this happened. You do not need to identify the lesson. You do not need to offer a verse immediately. You do not have to make their pain go away. Your job is not to stop the rain. Your invitation is to stand with them in it. Say their loved one's name. Remember the significant dates. Keep checking in after everyone else has moved on. Let silence be enough. Sometimes the most Christ-like thing we can offer is our willingness to stay. And this is what Jesus has done for us. He did not remain at a safe distance from human suffering. He entered it. He took on flesh. He wept. He experienced betrayal, rejection, pain, and death. Then he rose from the grave, still carrying scars. The resurrection did not erase the evidence of what Jesus had endured. His scars became evidence that love had entered the wound and death had not won. And that is our hope. Our hope is not that nothing painful will ever happen. Our hope is that there is no suffering Jesus will not enter, no grief he will not hold, and no grave from which he cannot bring resurrection. So perhaps the deepest question of the series is simply not, "God, where were you?" And it's not even God's question, "Where were you?" Perhaps the question beneath them both is, "Do you trust me?" Not, do you understand everything? Not, can you explain why this happened? Not, can you see how every piece will fit together? But will you remain with me? Will you remain when the prayer is unanswered? Will you remain when the pain lasts longer than you expected? Will you remain when the story does not receive the ending you wanted? Will you remain when God's presence is the only answer you receive? Psalm 84 says, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. That does not mean every day in God's presence will feel easy. It means that God's presence is better than a painless life without him. The world can offer us money, houses, careers, friendships, influence, success, applause, and security. But if we have everything and do not have Jesus, we actually have nothing. And if everything else is stripped away, but we still have Jesus, then the most important thing cannot be taken from us. Psalm 73 says, whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Notice that the psalmist does not say my flesh and heart will never fail because I have faith. He says they may fail. The grief may overwhelm me. The tears may come. The questions may remain, but God is still my portion. The storm is real, but the storm is not sovereign. The pain is real, but the pain does not have the final word. And as we close this series, I want to leave you with a few questions for reflection. Where have you been demanding an explanation when what you need most is the presence of God? And have you given yourself permission to grieve? Or have you been trying to perform strength? What shelter is God offering you through another person, through rest, through counseling, through the church, or through his word? And finally, is there someone in your life who does not need you to fix the storm, but simply needs you to stand beside them in the rain? And finally, if your circumstances do not change today, can you still whisper, Jesus, I am here, and I believe you are here too. Thank you so much for joining me for this final deep dive in our series, Where Were You? May you take shelter when shelter is available. May you allow others to gather near you. And when you find yourself standing in the rain, may you remember the storm came, the rain fell, you grieved, Jesus stayed. And by his grace, so will you. Until next time, may we continue to know Jesus and make his name known.